You know, every single day, you're making contracts without even giving it a second thought. That coffee you grabbed this morning, the stuff you just bought online, your groceries, they're all shaped by a really specific, powerful set of rules. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the law that makes it all work, India's Sale of Goods Act 1930. Let's break down the legal DNA of every purchase you make.
Seems almost silly to ask, right? You pay, you get coffee. End of story. But legally? Oh, it's so much more. In that simple exchange, ownership was transferred, a price was paid, and both you and the cafe took on a whole set of rights and responsibilities. Once you understand the legal blueprint of that one small transaction, you've basically got the key to understanding a huge chunk of commercial law.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll get a little bit of history on the act itself. Then, we'll dissect what makes a sales contract tick. We'll get into the super important difference between a sale and an agreement to sell, and we'll figure out what the law even considers to be goods. After that, we'll cover the mechanics of price and delivery, and finally, we'll wrap up by looking at some common contracts that look like sales, but really aren't.
Okay, before we can get into the nitty-gritty of a contract, we've got to understand the law that's pulling all the strings. The Sale of Goods Act didn't just appear out of nowhere, it actually has a pretty interesting backstory.
So way back in the day, the rules for selling things were just one chapter in the massive Indian Contract Act of 1872. But as business got more complex, it became obvious that the general rules just weren't cutting it. You needed specific regulations for buying and selling goods. So, on July 1st, 1930, the Sale of Goods Act was born, taking a lot of inspiration from a similar British law. A small tweak in 1963 officially dropped the word Indian from the title, and then much more recently in 2019, its reach was expanded to cover the whole of India.
So what is it that turns a simple exchange into a full-blown, legally recognized contract of sale? Well, the law is extremely clear about the ingredients you need. Let's break down the official recipe.
Okay, this is it. The core definition from Section 4 of the Act. And trust me, every single word here matters. It's a contract where a seller either transfers, as in right now it's done, or agrees to transfer, as in it's a promise for the future, the property in goods to a buyer for a price. We're about to unpack what each of those key parts really means.
For a sale to be legit, you have to tick all 6 of these boxes. First, you need 2 separate parties, a buyer and a seller. The thing being sold must be goods. We'll get to that definition in a bit. Now, this next one's important. The payment has to be in money. If you trade your laptop for a phone, that's barter, and it's covered by different laws. This act is all about transactions involving money. The real heart of it, though, is the transfer of ownership, what the law calls property, not just handing the item over. The definition is also broad enough to cover both sales that happen right now and agreements for sales in the future. And finally, none of this exists in a bubble. It still has to follow all the basic rules of a valid contract, like having a clear offer and acceptance.
Now, this word, property, can be a bit confusing. In the legal world, when we talk about a sale, we mean general property. That's the whole shebang. Full, absolute ownership and all the rights that come with it. It's totally different from special property, which is just a limited set of rights. For instance, if you pawn your watch, you're giving the pawnbroker special property, the right to hold it as security, but you're still the owner. A sale is a complete handover. The buyer becomes the new and full owner, period.
So we've touched on this idea that the law covers both a sale and an agreement to sell. And this isn't just about timing. The difference between these two has huge real-world consequences, especially when a deal goes sideways.
This chart really lays it all out. A sale is what we call an executed contract. The deal is done, ownership is transferred right then and there. An agreement to sell is executory. It's a promise to do it later. Now here's where it gets critical, the risk. Imagine you buy a specific painting. If it's a sale and the gallery burns down that night, well, legally, that painting was already yours. The risk and the loss is on you. But if it was just an agreement to sell, the risk would have stayed with the seller. See the difference? It also changes what happens if someone backs out. In a sale, the seller can sue for the full price. In an agreement to sell, they can typically only sue for damages, like their lost profit.
Okay, we know the contract has to be about goods. But what does the law actually consider goods? It's not as obvious as you might think. You can't sell a service or a legal right under this act, for instance. The definition is very specific.
Okay, let's trace the legal definition here. The starting point is every kind of movable property. So right off the bat, things like land and buildings are out. Then the law carves out 2 specific exceptions: actionable claims, which are basically the right to sue someone for a debt, and money itself. You can't buy money using this law. But here's what it does include, and some might surprise you. Stocks and shares, growing crops, grass, and even things that are attached to land, like timber, as long as the deal is to cut them down and sell them.
And it doesn't stop there. The Act then sorts these goods into three main buckets, and this is really important because it affects the type of contract you can have. First, you have existing goods, stuff the seller actually has right now. Then there are future goods and contingent goods, which are things the seller doesn't have yet or might never get. Let's break those down.
So within existing goods, you've got two flavors. First, specific goods. This is when you point at something and say, I want that one. You're buying that specific phone with that specific serial number. It's identified and agreed upon. Then you have unascertained goods. This is when the goods are just described. For example, a seller agrees to sell you 1 bag of wheat from a silo containing 100 bags. At that point, it's unascertained. It only becomes specific or ascertained when they pick out one particular bag and set it aside for you.
Future goods are pretty simple to grasp. It's stuff the seller's going to make or get after you make the deal, like agreeing to buy a car that hasn't been built yet. Contingent goods are a special type of future good. Here, the seller's ability to even get the goods depends on some event that might not happen. Like, I'll sell you this rare painting if I win it at the auction next week. The auction is the contingency. Now here's the absolute key takeaway. For both future and contingent goods, you can only have an agreement to sell, never an immediate sale. It makes perfect sense. You can't transfer ownership of something that doesn't exist or that you don't own yet.
All right, we've got the parties, the subject, and the type of deal. Now let's get into the engine room of the contract, the price, the deadlines, and how you actually prove ownership.
So, the price. It's the money part of the deal. The most obvious way to set it is to just write it into the contract. Or you could agree on a method, like the price will be set by an independent appraiser. Sometimes, if two people have been doing business for years, the price is just understood. But what if nobody says anything about the price? Does the whole contract just fail? Nope. The law steps in and says the buyer has to pay a reasonable price. And what's reasonable? Well, it's basically the fair market value of the goods at the time of delivery.
Okay, this is a super practical point that trips a lot of people up. When it comes to deadlines, the law treats payment and delivery very differently. Generally, the deadline for payment is not considered a core part of the contract. If the buyer pays late, the seller usually can't just cancel the whole deal. They have to deliver the goods and then sue for the payment plus any damages. But the time of delivery, that is usually considered the essence of the contract. A delay in getting goods can shut down a business. So if the seller is late, the buyer often has the right to just walk away from the deal entirely.
So, how do you prove you own 1,000 tons of steel that's on a ship in the middle of the ocean? You use a document of title. Think of it as the legal key to the goods. It's a piece of paper that proves you have ownership and control. The classic example is a bill of lading in shipping. It's a receipt from the shipping line, but it's also the title deed. Whoever physically holds that document can claim the cargo at the other end. In the eyes of the law, holding that paper is as good as holding the goods themselves. All right, for our last section, let's really sharpen our focus. One of the best ways to understand what a contract of sale is to look at some things that seem similar but are legally something else entirely. This one gets people all the time. A hire purchase feels like you're just buying something in installments, right? But it's not a sale. In a hire purchase, you are just a renter, a hirer, with an option to buy at the end. Ownership stays with the seller until you make that very last payment. That means you can't sell the item before then, and if you miss payments, they can take it back. The key word is option. You have the option to buy, but you're not locked in. You could also just return the item and stop paying.
And then there's bailment. This is all about temporarily handing over your stuff for a reason, with the understanding that you'll get it back. Dropping your car at the garage, leaving your coat at a coat check, giving your laptop to a repair shop, that's all bailment. You're only transferring possession, never ownership, and there's always a duty to return the goods. In a sale, ownership is gone for good. The buyer has zero obligation to ever give it back.
So let's bring it all home. Think about this. You list your old phone for sale online. Someone clicks buy and agrees to pay when it arrives. At that moment, have you made a sale, instantly transferring ownership and risk to them? Or is it an agreement to sell, where ownership only changes hands once you actually ship it and they receive it? The answer tells you everything about who's responsible if it gets lost in the mail. Thanks for diving into this with me.